Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morena, good morning. I'm Sue McKay from Philanthropy New Zealand, based in Wellington. The warmest of greetings to everybody here today. As many of you will know, we planned to have this both sides of the coin event face-to-face in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch in late March and April, but very sadly we found ourselves cancelling them in Auckland at the very last minute as the reality of COVID-19 set in. Thank you to those who stuck by us, and a special thanks to our platinum sponsor Perpetual Guardian, who supported those face-to-face events and is supporting this event today. The aim of the both sides of the coin is to provide insight into the world of the other, for funders into the world of fund seekers and vice versa. It's a chance to ask questions and also to make comments. So you can address your questions to in the chat function where everyone else will see them, or if you wish to ask them anonymously, you can direct your chat just to me. We've got kind of 3 speaker sets today, and we'll have time after every speaker set for questions. We won't be identifying people who have asked questions if you choose just to contact me directly. We will be making a recording of this webinar publicly available, and if you've found it valuable, please do share it with others who you think will also be interested. And as always with all of our events, we're very keen to know whether we've met our objective, so we'll be sending out a survey pretty soon after the webinar today. So I'm going to speak first to give an overview of philanthropic trends, and we will then hand over to Perpetual Guardian's Head of Philanthropy, Liz Gibbs, who will introduce their speakers, Kate and Tanya Cooke, who represent both sides of the coin, the funder and the fundee. We'll then introduce Emily Mason from the Impact Lab, who will talk about the role of impact from both sides of the coin, funders and fund seekers. And she'll leave you with some tips and thoughts on measuring your impact. And we're going to make sure we wrap up tightly at 11:30 AM. So thank you to all our speakers. Okay, so moving into speaker mode. I'm going to start by talking about 5 international philanthropic trends that have relevance to Aotearoa New Zealand. Then I'm going to focus more on New Zealand trends. Interestingly, that COVID-19 has sped up. There's going to be a lot of generalisations in what I say, as the community sector is wonderfully diverse and it experiences philanthropy and grant making in many ways. And the funders are also, as participants will know, incredibly different as well in terms of what they fund and how they fund things. So please do bear in mind that one size does not fit all with the trends. So the first global trend I'm going to touch on today is an increasing international critique of philanthropy. Overseas, there is increased scrutiny of philanthropy and grant making in terms of how it makes its money, how it gives it away, who to, and what that impact is. Private philanthropy is not accountable to anyone, and there's increased commentary around the importance of community accountability. We're not seeing the same level of public comment in New Zealand, apart from in philanthropic circles. And one thing I've been struck by in this role is the way that the philanthropic sector is always critiquing itself and is very aware of the power that money brings. So it's a very live discussion within philanthropy. The second international trend is around funding for human rights. Obviously, philanthropy and grant making responds to the evolving needs of the world, and there's an increased focus on human rights as a result of the huge number of refugees we've seen in recent years and other human rights atrocities. There's also a significant focus on the damage that's been done to Indigenous peoples and awareness that current structures and processes continue the problem. And so in New Zealand, many funders are looking hard at how they can build better knowledge of Te Ao Māori, be a better tiriti partner, and strengthen relationships with mana whenua and tangata whenua so they can do better to fund Māori aspirations. It's pretty widely accepted within our funder membership, and we have many discussions about this, that philanthropy is a colonial structure. Therefore, just like other sectors, we have institutional racism in the way we operate. There's been an increased philanthropic focus on climate change. That is another global trend. And last year in New Zealand, we published some research on philanthropic funding to the environment, which can be found on our website. And it did show that only a tiny percentage of philanthropic funding in New Zealand is going to environmental causes. Anecdotally, because we're a bit data poor in this area, we think that the proportion of funding going to the environment is growing as we hear more funders announcing specific initiatives to fund the environment. It is going to be interesting to see how the economic recession that's caused by COVID-19 may disrupt what is being funded. As with many COVID-19 implications, it's just too early to tell. Time will tell. The second last international trend I'll touch on is advocacy and systems change. So there's a number of terms out there to describe different types of philanthropy, and one is strategic philanthropy, which aims to fund solutions to the cause of a problem rather than fund the symptoms. So to use a really oversimplified example, strategic philanthropy tries to prevent hungry kids. Versus other types of giving that fund food to give to the hungry children to alleviate that kind of symptom. Amongst strategic philanthropy, there's growing awareness of the importance of advocacy to create system change. Advocacy to the government of what policy levers are needed to change things, or advocacy to raise public awareness to get the behaviour change needed for system change. And this global trend is a really hot topic in New Zealand. Some New Zealand funders have been operating in the space for years, while others currently don't fund advocacy or system change. So the last international trend that I'm just going to mention is that is the data informing giving. So it's not surprising, given technology supports more accessible data, and we're getting more sophisticated in terms of our thinking around what makes a difference. So we're really hungry for data on philanthropy in New Zealand, where it goes, its outputs and the outcomes it generates. And I'm going to say no more on that and leave it to Emily Mason from the Impact Lab, who's the expert in this area. So turning specifically to Aotearoa New Zealand, earlier this year, JB Ware released its support report, which was developed in collaboration with Philanthropy New Zealand, and that provides a profile of giving in New Zealand. The New Zealand support report provides really good scene setting for philanthropic trends in New Zealand. It said that 3.8 billion was given in philanthropic funding in 2018, and just over half of this was given by individuals, members of the public, versus organised giving by trusts, foundations, etc. Just struggling to find my next bit of paper. Sorry about this. Right, sorry about that. Too many bits of paper around me. So one startling fact in the JB Ware research is that 91% of philanthropy and grant making goes to just over 9% of charities. That means that 91% of charities are competing for just 9% of the funds. So this is an ongoing trend, big high profile brands accessing the vast majority of funding. Other trends, noting that these were all pre-COVID, were an increase in business giving, pre-COVID again, so it will be interesting to see what occurs in that space now, and an increase in individual giving. There are fewer people giving, but they are giving more per person. Connected to that, there's an expected transfer of wealth to the next generation who may well give very differently. And the cause receiving most private donations, and that's the bulk of the giving in New Zealand, is religion, but that's on the decline. Social and community and disability charities have seen the greatest increase in philanthropy, and the report predicted that the environment and universities will gain in popularity as causes to give to. So you can find this report on the JB Ware website or on ours, and it's a real treasure trove of information in terms of where money's coming from and where it's going. So last month, we released details of a survey of PNZ funder members about their response to COVID-19. So this survey highlighted the impact that lower returns on investment are having on the pool of philanthropic funding. Our respondents overall indicated about a 5% drop in the funding amount that they expected to distribute over the next 12 months. Now, this is a very early snapshot in an evolving situation, and I think about 72 of our funder members responded, and I think there was one gaming trust that responded. So obviously there are some areas in which the funding decrease is a lot greater. Really interestingly, we can link many of the funders' immediate responses to the increased community need that they saw and the changed circumstances of many not-for-profits to existing trends in philanthropy. So as I said in the intro, it just feels like COVID-19 sped up the trends. One trend, which is occurring in patches rather than universally, is a move to higher trust models of funding, longer term agreements, and simplifying application and reporting processes. So in COVID-19, Philanthropy New Zealand produced an open letter to funders asking them to adopt best practice principles of proactively communicating with grant recipients any changes in giving and processes, and to explain why. That funders be as accessible and responsive to requests for information and engagement from those they fund, and that they stay as informed as possible of government support and activity to know what additional help their grantees may get or where there are gaps in support. And that was actually really, really challenging, because one of the features of COVID-19 that the philanthropic sector noticed was the speed and the scale of government responses, and also sometimes the quite understandable delay in details following funding announcements. The letter asked funders to collaborate with each other to identify ways to ease the burden on community groups, and to consider what flexibility they can offer, including trusting not-for-profits that funds go to the highest need rather than necessarily spending it on the activity that was outlined in the funding contract, reducing reporting requirements, and extending reporting and spending deadlines. And our survey showed that many of the funders were focusing on those best practice responses. For example, the survey found about half of the responding funders had adapted agreements with grant holders to introduce more flexibility. And another example, around half had taken proactive approaches to fund community organisations working with those in greatest need. The scale of that community need that immediately emerged showed the benefits of funder collaboration. This is a strong trend pre-COVID-19. Immediate collaboration ranged from sharing information on the community need that they were seeing and what their responses were, through to establishing joint application processes, which is quite intensive collaboration from a funder perspective. For example, in the Waikato, funders created a one door for community groups to apply to for funding from them all, and they worked together to proactively check in with not-for-profits they expected would be needing extra support. And as with a lot of the positive change that occurred as a silver lining to COVID-19, the philanthropic and grant-making sector is now asking what progress did it make during the immediate response phase that should be turned into business as usual. Let's keep the good stuff. I do feel I need to restate my earlier point about these trends not being universal. Many webinar listeners will be really aware that there were some funders that demonstrated no flexibility to changing community need or not-for-profit circumstances. For example, gaming trusts seeking refunds where a charity could no longer deliver on its agreement. Another important point is that while some funders are set up so they can respond immediately, and they chose to respond immediately, other funders are set up to respond in the medium term, or they choose to respond in the medium term to major events. They see that public donations and government often take care of the immediate need, and philanthropy's strength is in supporting the medium and longer term recovery when community needs can change and settle. And obviously, and quite sadly, our funders have got quite a bit of experience in funding events with the earthquakes, with the terrorist shooting prior to COVID. So I think the final trend worth touching on is that there are more ways to give and more ways to make a difference than what there previously were. There's a rise in knowledgeable intermediaries that people can give money to that will distribute them. For example, Perpetual Guardian have a foundation. There's other national options, and there's the local community foundation movement. There's many niche generosity schemes like the 1% Collective, which encourages people to give 1% of their income and choose from about a dozen charities that the 1% Collective works with. There's crowdfunding like Give a Little, now managed by Perpetual Guardian, and crowdfunding's been around so long it's no longer a trend, but the trend continues that there's more ways to give to individuals and social enterprise businesses as well as charities, so that broadens the giving options. And philanthropic funders are increasingly using their capital for impact investment, and we expect this trend, which is a really exciting one, to grow. So it's definitely a more complex picture. So way back in March, I contacted some of our community members asking them for input into this talk and what they were seeing. And their answers fitted with the key themes outlined, but they also highlighted the patchy nature of progress in the philanthropic sector, and that there's much more that can be done to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of giving. They showed the jigsaw puzzle that is seeking funding for services, often from a mix of sources like government, business, philanthropic funders, public donations, and then also undertaking activity to gain revenue. So a lot of philanthropists and grant makers are putting a lot of effort into improving the sector in all sorts of ways, and that's one of the wonderful things I get to see in my job. Philanthropy New Zealand itself is currently exploring the establishment of a platform that seeks to make the connection between the supply and the demand for philanthropic funding easier for both parties. And if people are interested in this, they can email me on sue@philanthropy.org.nz if they're interested in finding out more about that project. So, in summary, the international trends are that increased scrutiny of philanthropy, giving to the environment, increased philanthropy to support human rights, understanding of the impact of philanthropy on Indigenous people, data-informed giving, which we're going to hear more about, and more systems-focused philanthropy and support for advocacy. In the New Zealand Support Report, a treasure trove of trends. An increase in business giving, an increase in individual giving. Fewer people giving, but they're giving more. An expectation and interest in seeing how the next generation give when there is a transfer of wealth. And there's definitely changes, as it always has been, in the causes that people are choosing to give to. And in New Zealand, just to point out and summarise that COVID-19 has sped up and highlighted some trends: more high trust and longer term giving, simplification of application and reporting, greater funder collaboration, and the range of giving options in terms of who to give to and how to give or invest continues to grow. So I am now going to stop and just check for any questions before I hand over to the next set of speakers. So I have a question here as an example to the advocacy and systems change focus. That's a trend. And I guess an example of that would be the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective, which Anjum Rahman co-founded after the terrorist shootings in March of last year. And that is a piece of advocacy to develop a strategy as to what we need to do in order to create a more inclusive New Zealand and minimise the likelihood of another tragic event like that occurring. So that's probably the recent example I can give of that.
And we've seen that help the sexual, it's Kirsten Taylor here from Perpetual Guardian. They are also looking at an advocacy linked system change piece of work around sexual abuse.
That's great. So there's no more questions or comments at this stage. So please do keep them rolling in. And at the end, we'll have some time to, it doesn't need, your questions don't need necessarily to be attached to any particular speaker. Also welcome comments, because that's good kind of feedback and information for us, which we take into account in all sorts of ways in our work. So I am now going to hand over to Liz Gibbs, someone very special who is the head of philanthropy at Perpetual Guardian. So yes, thank you, Kirsten. And sitting with Liz is Kirsten Taylor, so you can see her name on the photo. And so Liz has significant experience from over 25 years working in philanthropy, NGO management and governance. And her current NFP governance roles include being Deputy Chair of UNICEF New Zealand and board member of the Media Works Foundation, in addition to her day job. And as I said before, Philanthropy New Zealand, we're a not-for-profit and with diverse kind of revenue streams, and we're significantly helped by Perpetual Guardian's ongoing support for our organisation through its platinum level sponsorship. So welcome Liz and your team, and I'll now hand over to you.
Thanks, Sue. Kia ora koutou. Real pleasure to be here today and be with great colleagues virtually, and fantastic. The Philanthropy New Zealand's had such a great response to this webinar. Very briefly, Perpetual Guardian is a trust company, and as a trust company, we act in the best interests of each of the trusts that we represent. That is actually locked in law, so we have that obligation that we take very seriously. We manage over 600 charitable trusts, which means we have very, very diverse funding rounds, which one of our great colleagues, Jessie, who's off camera because she doesn't want to be on the screen, manages very well. So we're not running a family foundation, for example, that just has one set of purposes. We're running a whole bunch of different funding rounds, hundreds of them throughout each year. And some of which are managed through our branch network, which Kate, my colleague sitting on the screen, is one of our client managers out of our Christchurch branch, but also we manage some of them centrally. So we have a very broad range of charitable trusts and not one fixed purpose. So quite a different type of setup. The good news is many of our clients are actually charities. So we are a funder, but we also represent the best interests of many of the charities that we also work with. So really welcome the opportunity to speak to any charities if we can help with advice or help support your activities. We run a whole range of different offerings, and most recently, as well as I think Sue mentioned, we recently acquired Give a Little, which is fantastic to have that crowdfunding platform as part of our Philanthropy suite of offerings as well. So great. Also, thanks, Sue, for walking through the trends. I'm really pleased to tell you that some of the innovation that Perpetual Guardian has done does echo some of the trends that Sue was talking to. Most recently, the COVID-19 Response Fund. We actually wrapped up a whole bunch of the trusts that we manage for a COVID response fund to support particularly OPEX and salaries. We ran that in a very short form for us for 1 month from go to woe. We also secured funding from another philanthropic funder, Tax Management New Zealand, through their Wilberforce Foundation, and they supplemented our funding. So in the end, we got around $1 million out to 41 organisations within a 4-week period, and with a particular focus on prioritising operational expenditure, salaries, areas that are typically really hard to fundraise for. Now, I'm really glad to tell you that we will continue that kind of approach where we have the flexibility to do that for particular trusts that we manage. COVID, again, of course, as Sue's also mentioned, has impacted on investment portfolios from which we grant. So we will be adjusting our grant making as a result of that. We'll be announcing that in early August. The good news, however, is that we will continue to prioritise wherever possible flexible approaches to funding, including OPEX and salaries. And we will be encouraging all of our colleagues around the country to prioritise funding to areas of critical high need, like mental health, like community support, and other areas that are really, really going to need it. And I think we will see that need increase quite significantly. The final part from me before I hand over to my excellent colleague Kirsten, who runs our Perpetual Guardian Foundation, is that impact is critical, and great to see you on the call, Emily, as well. We have partnered with Impact Lab. We think it's really important on behalf of our clients, and because we're managing their money and managing their philanthropy, and some of those clients are charitable, some of those are high net worth individuals, some of those are families, really important that we can demonstrate to them the impact that their generosity is having. So we're delighted to partner with Impact Lab. Great that Emily can tell us far more about that later on in this call. So no more from me. Happy to take questions later on, but over to Kirsten.
Hi everyone, thanks Liz. Kirsten here. Some of you may know, some of you may not, that we have a foundation at Perpetual Guardian. We have about 100 funds that sit under our master trust structure. Some of them are for charitable organisations in the form of endowment funds. Some are charitable funds set up by individuals who have specific intent. And some of them are wide funds under the environment, digital, or medical research, where we have a community of donors that have come together to create a fund about something or an organisation they are specifically very passionate about. We operate in a partnership grant model, so we usually have, through conversations with the community and our board members, we establish connections to organisations that meet the terms of the funds, where we do have discretion to provide funding in a partnership model. Other funds that we manage just have named beneficiaries. So we have, for example, the Gut Cancer Foundation and the Bowel Cancer Foundation. They, any money and income generated from their funds is paid back to that beneficiary, but we invite a community of donors to participate in building the capital value of that fund to help both of those causes move forward. So that's really the foundation in a nutshell. One thing I did want to map out about Perpetual Guardian and its funding streams was about the 600 charitable trusts that Liz mentioned. So about 2/3 of those trusts have fixed charitable purposes. That means that the wonderful individuals who had the foresight to give to our philanthropic sector really felt a passionate link to an organisation in particular. So they asked a professional trustee company to steward those funds, sometimes during their lifetime and then after their lifetime, to ensure that those funds and the capital funds are protected and that income continues to be generated for those organisations' good work. Then there are a portion, around 1/3 of funds that we manage, that have layers of discretion attached to them. Almost always there are wishes attached to those, things that the individuals felt were really important to them during their lifetime. Sometimes it's youth, sometimes it's education, sometimes it's vulnerable women. It is a very, very broad spectrum. And we, as their trustee and trusted partner, help them steward funds to those types of purposes and causes in the philanthropy sector. So we're always looking to match, and all of those funds, which we refer to as our publicly contestable funds, are advertised on the Perpetual Guardian website. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Kate Palmer from our Christchurch office, in the blue on the left, and Tanya Cooke from Cholmondeley, the fundraising and marketing manager, who are going to talk to a specific funder-fundee relationship that we have at Perpetual Guardian. Over to you, Kate and Tanya.
Thanks, Kirsten. So kia ora whanau, my name is Kate Palmer and I'm a client manager at the Christchurch office of Perpetual Guardian. So as Kirsten mentioned, I manage a number of charitable trusts. And in my portfolio I have about 60, but as she also mentioned, only a smaller proportion of those actually have discretionary funding. So those are the ones that are advertised on our website that people can apply for. And they are as varied as the people who set them up. There are very few of them that are fully discretionary. Usually they'll have some wishes about where the donor wanted the funds to go. So it's really important when you're looking for funding that you find a trust that has a criteria that you can apply for the people looking for funding. And so Cholmondeley Children's Centre is one of the organisations that we've had a long relationship with. Perpetual Guardian has been funding Cholmondeley for many years. And over the course of my years of working for Perpetual Guardian, I've been over to Cholmondeley a couple of times and met with board members and children who are there and been to different events there. And I've met Tanya through the application process. So Tanya, do you want to talk about that relationship?
Hi everyone. Hi, so my name is Tanya. I'm the fundraising and marketing manager at Cholmondeley Children's Centre in Governor's Bay, Christchurch, and we provide respite and emergency care to children and families who are experiencing stress and crisis, and we support around 500 children a year. We have been around for 95 years, so have a long history here in Canterbury, and obviously with Perpetual Guardian. So I've been with Cholmondeley around 2.5 years, and quite quickly after I started, established a relationship with Perpetual Guardian. And really how it works for us, at the beginning of the year, we put together our trust and grants calendar for the year, and we identify what projects we're going to work on that year, what the needs are for Cholmondeley, and then as a team we identify the funding opportunities. Now at that time, that's when we typically meet with Kate and discuss the different funding opportunities that you have. So there's quite a number. I think we have about 8 different trusts that we apply to throughout the year. So it's really important for us at that time to communicate with Kate just around what the current needs and projects are for Cholmondeley at that time. So that, to me, that's a great opportunity for us to get together and figure out what the plan is. And Kate's really great at letting us know what's on the agenda for the year and maybe what's changed, because just there are lots of things that can change throughout the year. So that's how it starts, and then throughout the year we just keep in contact with Kate about the different applications, and we always have a phone call before we submit an application, not just with Perpetual Guardian but with every funder, and even better if we can have you come over to the centre or a coffee, just depending on geographically where you're placed. So that engagement is really important, and maybe we talk a little bit more about what we talk about during that time.
Because as a funder, when I go through the applications and put together, often we'll be meeting with a board of advisors. Sometimes we have co-trustees or advisors to meet with. So it's an interesting process going through grants and making that decision, and a lot of different factors can come into play. Sometimes we don't have enough funding, or often we don't have as much funding as we would like, and we have to make a priority decision about how we're going to choose between all these wonderful applications. And board personalities come into play sometimes. People have different priorities. Sometimes there's compromises to be made while keeping within the wishes of, or the constraints of the trust deed and the wishes of the donor. But sometimes sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback, it's distracting me. Sometimes we have to turn down applications because they don't fit the criteria or they're not a perfect match, and that's something which breaks my heart to see, because I know how much work goes into applications, I know how much time, and I sometimes see applications come in and I think, well, it's a good application, they've put in a lot of information here, but it doesn't quite fit what we're looking for. And in those cases, it would have been really good to talk to the person making the application and I'm always very, very happy to do that, to speak to people, you know, at the point where they're thinking about making an application or halfway through it. And I know our team at Perpetual Guardian is very happy to help with that. We have branches all around New Zealand, and there are charitable trusts that, if you like, they live in the different branches. So there's our different branch managers all have personal knowledge of each trust that you're applying for. So you can always call up, find out who that branch manager is, give them a call, and yeah, just ask a few questions, just to save yourself a lot of time if you're applying for funding, and also save our time for looking through grants which are inappropriate.
I think that's so important to mention, Kate. We advertise the strategic matching criteria on our website to enable these organisations, like Tanya was saying at Cholmondeley, where the funder's intent lies. So we really ask that organisations go on there and really put their strategic hats on and find a strong link prior to having those conversations. The links need to be either to the wishes, sometimes to the geographic, sometimes to all of the above. And it's really important to see that synergy before applying. We really feel so sad when people apply and they very clearly do not meet the criteria. We're seeing a significant increase of that at the moment, even from highly experienced fundraisers. And we understand that that's a symptom of the current environment around COVID, stretched resources. They were stretched before, they're even more stretched now. So we try and be compassionate and considerate wherever we can. But as I said, it breaks our heart when we know that someone's gone to that time and effort and there isn't that strategic match. So having a phone call is one way to go about it. The philanthropy team, we have a philanthropy team that sits in Auckland that tries to help the branch staff who are very much on the front lines with our clients. So that's probably the best place to route any of your initial contact. I'll pop the email address, which is philanthropy@pgtrust.co.nz. That's the best place to put an initial inquiry, and then we can build a more specific response around that if there is a need to do so.
Yeah, and also just to mention, we do have 5 branches. The answer to Dawn, I think, put the question up about our Auckland branch managers. We've got 5 branches across Auckland. So it really, as Kirsten's just said, best first point of contact is through the philanthropy team, and they will refer you to the right person. Sorry, Kate, back to you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point to make. The other thing I just wanted to mention too is sometimes we get a good application, but it's asking for a lot more than what we can give. Yeah. So that's been an important part of our relationship, isn't it, Tanya? Yes, that you know, that you might call up and just say, well, how should I pitch this? Yeah. You know, should I, if I'm asking for 50,000, is it going to be just like that's, you know, not? And we do have some guidance on the websites about sort of roughly what sort of the funding pool is. So we will give you an idea, but you can sometimes, just need to fine tune amounts because it can be off-putting in a board situation to find an application that's, you know, way out of kilter with the other level that people are asking for. And the other thing to mention is that we are really aware that there's often a high turnover of staff, particularly in volunteer roles and charities. So when there's a changeover sometimes in the funding, the person responsible for fundraising, the information might not get passed on about when application rounds are coming up, what's required in terms of reporting. So we do what we can to remind people if we say, oh gosh, you know, this year we haven't had an application from, you know, an organisation that normally applies. I will try and contact that organisation and just remind them, but obviously we can't do that for everyone. So yeah, and also for the keeping up with the compliance reporting, accountability reporting is important, but that's something that can be overlooked. Yeah,
and that timing thing, you know, I've found when I've started this role, it's really important to go through the calendar and just touch base with the funders to say, I'm new, we're here, just hi, but give me some time and we'll get in contact rather than miss out on any opportunities. So it was a good point early on to say, please let me know if there's anything coming up that we might miss. And you were great at just outlining what the year looked like as far as Cholmondeley was within your funding.
Oh yeah. Just as an example of one of the trusts that I manage, it was interesting. We had a lovely lady who had never married, didn't have children, and she towards the end of her life she set up a charitable trust in her lifetime, and she had a very set out. She had her favourite organisations that she wanted to support, and Cholmondeley was one of them. And when she died, she left a memorandum of wishes of how that is still to be managed by us. So, going into the future. So, if any of those charitable organisations were to cease to exist or to start to perhaps go in a different direction to what she wanted to support, then we would have the discretion to throw it open for applications. But so it's one that's it's non-discretionary, but we still have that relationship just to check in with the organisations to make sure that they're still fulfilling the wishes of the donor. So yeah, but that's a lovely. It's a very it's quite a lot of trust involved, and it's quite a responsibility for us to make sure that we're fulfilling the wishes of the lady who I met during her lifetime, and it's a real honour to be able to do that. Yeah. So I think that's anything else to add, Tanya?
We've got a few questions popping up in the chat for you, ladies. So I will ask them for you. So for Tanya, why does your relationship with PG work so much better than with other funders, if that is indeed the case? Can you tell us about a time when a funding relationship did not work?
I'd like to think that we have a great relationship with all of our funders, and that's something we work. It's very consistent in our team, regardless of the amount of funding. We make sure we remain fully engaged with all of our funders. So I wouldn't say Perpetual Guardian was any better than any other funders, but I think the reason why it does work well for our relationship is that we're consistent with our communication. So there are a number of times that we engage throughout the year, and that seems to work well, and it's and I think that we have the opportunity for face-to-face coffee, which meetings and have a coffee, which is great, and we can just be really clear around what's ahead and what's the expectations for Cholmondeley and how that works. So I think that works really great. As far as what's not worked with other funders, what springs to mind is due to lack of engagement with a particular funder. we've missed an application cut-off time, and there wasn't another opportunity for another year. So I think that it's just really important to keep engaged around the timing of the applications as well. So that's a classic example I can provide.
I can add to that. You know, we see funding relationships fall down you know, regularly. The most common one we mentioned before is when that work hasn't been done to strategically match the work to the intent of the settlor. So it may look like Perpetual Guardian have hold the reins in these relationships, but we are very much acting on behalf of a private donor who has left these funds, and we treat it like they're sitting around the table when we're making decisions for funding. We know that sometimes this process is imperfect. For example, you know, people, when they're sending applications, they have difficulty in expressing impact, and we're really interested in impact because we think of it along the lines of how can this person's money make a real difference. So if applications, sometimes, you know, the funding relationship doesn't work that well if applications don't clearly articulate impact, even if that's not the impact that eventuates. If it's different impact or more impact, that's fine, but just the ability to understand your sector well enough that you can construe some impact from your intended work. You know, that's one thing. Not being able to articulate the need and feel very clearly confident that you're not duplicating that need, that need speaks to the needs of your constituents. We look at who's around your board table. If you are supporting youth, you know, are you connected with youth, and are you ensuring that the strategic decisions that you're making are very specifically for youth, having spoken to youth? So sometimes the funding relationship can fall down around those types of things. We occasionally juggle the scheme of distribution on our published schedules, and people are left disappointed when they haven't remained close to those schedules. We've changed the goalposts, and like Tanya said, an opportunity that you would have ordinarily applied for and had been in serious contention for has passed and doesn't open again for another year. We find people are often very, very disappointed if we have done that. So we try and avoid it like the plague, but we do also place the onus on our applicants to ensure that they are really close to that schedule at all times, because it can sometimes be a moving feast. We try and keep it as standard as possible, but new things can come in and things can come off. And that has never been more important to mention than presently, where our income streams and levels are changing quite significantly with the impact of investments not generating the same amount of income for granting as would ordinarily be available.
And because on that last point that Kirsten made, because we're a trustee company, we have the obligation to act in perpetuity, so forever or for a long time, for our clients. And that means we have to be very prudent in how we distribute our funds. Now, the investment portfolio that we run, which is about $700 million from our 600 charitable trusts, is fluctuating quite dramatically at the moment. Luckily, it's bounced back actually quite significantly since May and June. But what we don't want to be doing is granting to the detriment of our medium and long-term ability to support communities. So that does mean for the interim, for the next 12 months, we will be reducing some of our grant funding in order that we can maintain our medium and long-term support back to normal levels and greater levels, hopefully, over that longer period of time. And that's part of us being prudent as a trustee. Now, the way that we're trying to offset that is by giving as much as we can, give greater flexibility to where those funds can go. Again, the steer that we're providing to our teams around the country is to prioritise operating expenditure, salaries, etc., and areas of great community need. And for the few trusts where we are able to do this, we will also potentially look at using capital. Usually we only use income, but for very few trusts, we have some discretion to use capital. And again, we have to offset that against the medium and long-term benefit back to communities. So we'll be issuing information about that on our website on the 4th of August. But this is a good opportunity to give people that heads up. And there will be information out to all of our branches on that as well very shortly.
Someone has pitched a question in regards to compromises as a funder and how PG have to compromise. Kate mentioned compromising. Sometimes, and Kate may want to add to this, there are a number of ways in which we compromise. Often we are around the board table with friends, family, associates and professional advisors who have a very strong view, subject matter experts and the like, of either how their friend would have liked funds applied and or what an environmental subject matter expert would see to be the best environmental grant to make. So around board tables, there are often compromises. We as trustee hold a strong view. We pay around 3,000 to 4,000 grants a year. So through that work, we see a lot, we network a lot. We try and get in front of the community as best we possibly can, acknowledging there are 30,000 registered charities out there and we can't speak to absolutely everybody as in depth as we would love to do. So that's, I think, the kind of compromise that Kate was referring to. More recent compromises coming through very regularly are people saying, hey, we applied for this due to COVID, for example. We actually need to use the money for something different. Now, so long as the different application still aligns to the wishes of our underlying donor, we are absolutely happy to accommodate that. There's an outside chance that if the changed purpose doesn't match, the funds will need to be returned, but we try and compromise and make that a really open conversation to ensure that you can keep it in 99.9% of the cases. So we try and compromise there, and we have those conversations even pre-COVID. So those are probably the primary areas. Were there any other areas, Kate, that you thought of when you made that comment?
Yeah, you covered it pretty well. I think we're sitting around, as you mentioned, we're often sitting around the board table for these decisions. And I view our role as that we have this sort of holy trust, if you like, of what we're trying to do, of to get out to distribute funds in accordance with the wishes of the donor and we're in the constraints of the trustee. Sometimes we get, as you mentioned, people who have strong opinions and sometimes prejudices, and for instance, they might look at an application and say, "Oh, I haven't heard of these people, so I'm not going to, not going to look at their application, or I'll discount it without looking at it properly." And our view is my view of our role as the professional trustee is to say, okay, we need to give due attention to all of the applications and to put sort of personal preferences aside as much as possible to make independent, impartial decisions about our.
We try, well said, Kate, we try and sideline subconscious and conscious bias as much as possible, operate around board tables that test those theories and apply consistency. It's an imperfect science because there's so many gorgeous things out there and it's hard not to be triggered or feel an emotional connection, but that is all part of the process and why we work together so closely to regulate those types of scenarios. Another question we have here is, what is the matching tool, and can funders use that to see where they could co-fund? Over to our Head of Philanthropy, Liz.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, we do have a matching tool. We've actually just created that on our Give a Little platform, and there was recently one of our new partners, Kiwi Wealth, wanted to contribute some funding to some of the food banks that, of course, have been doing fantastic work through COVID. and beyond. So there is a matching tool for donors and funders to use now on Give a Little, so that the Give a Little campaigns are typically set up with a financial target, whatever that might be, $10,000, $50,000. The matching tool enables you to see, as a funder or a donor, how your contribution is contributing to that target, and it calls for other funders to match that. We also did that at Perpetual Guardian during lockdown, actually supporting the RSA because they couldn't go ahead with their poppy appeal due to lockdown. So we ran a grant process which secured a grant from one of the trusts that had the right terms and settler intent for RSA. So we contributed a grant, but we also put some company money into that campaign in order to help stimulate the revenue, and also Tax Management New Zealand put some further funds in, and all up that raised around $300,000 for the RSA in around 10 days. So I'd encourage you to hop on to Give a Little. Again, you can email any of the colleagues at givealittle@givealittle.co.nz, and they've got a great customer services team. They'll be really happy to steer you in that direction.
Another question that we've got here, do you include roundtable applications in reporting? We have been looking at that, thinking about that, talking about that. We are doing it more so around the foundation, in our Perpetual Guardian Foundation, that is, around some of the applications we do there. We also currently are in conversations around applications for vulnerable women. Those are all roundtable applications and roundtable reporting. That fund was published about a month and a half ago. Expressions of interest have now closed, and that's now moving to the face-to-face application process. Another couple of questions that came through, I think anonymously, so I will just feed them back to the group. One of them was, does PG feel that seeking funding through websites and newspapers is the best approach in reaching the most needy and warranted causes? I can absolutely understand the basis of this question, and the short answer is that no, we definitely don't. Usually this is just our mode of lead generation. What we have to be very, very careful of in the way that we administer our charitable funds is a balance between getting the most amount of money out to the community and administering it in a cost-effective way that meets the wishes of the underlying donors. We don't want to over-administrate it to the point where our fees for doing so are more than the funds that get out to charity. So we're constantly walking this very fine line. Sorry, I was getting a little bit of feedback that was just distracting me for a moment. While we use that to generate leads, the Philanthropy team and our talent bench and our network of philanthropic advisors and subject matter experts are often sought to broker applications into the trusts that we manage. We often It's rare that we don't hear of something really special that's going on out there in the network. Sometimes the timing's a little bit off, the project's happening, and the funding that might have been a lovely match has already passed for the year. So there's some of those challenges, but we do work hard to hear from, to collaborate with, and make sure that we really are across all of those significant projects in the industry.
Thank you, Perpetual Guardian and Tanya, for that information. There was so much great information shared that is of general value in terms of, regardless of who you're applying to. I particularly like the point around talking to a funder and getting as much information as you can before you put in the hard yards on an application, and as well as lots of tips for engaging with Perpetual Guardian itself. Now, I know that I will expect that Kirsten will be happy to keep answering questions via the chat and Q&A function, so keep them coming in. And now I'd like to welcome Emily Mason. So Emily is co-founder of the Impact Lab, and she's the Chief Executive of consultancy Frank Advice. And Emily says that her mission is supporting people and organisations to do good by understanding what works, for whom and at what cost. And prior to her current roles, Emily worked in central government, drawing on the best publicly available data to measure impact to drive improvement. And hopefully you can all see Emily's screen, which describes what she's going to talk about. So I will turn over to Emily now. Thank you, Emily.
Morena koutou. Yeah, my children call me the nerd herder. I think from what Sue said, I'm also a recovering public servant, but I am truly passionate about how do we think about impact and use understanding of impact to drive investment and effort into the things that really make a difference. So today I'm going to talk for maybe 15 minutes or so on what is impact and why does it matter for grant funders and seekers. I thought I'd start with a little story on the slide. This is my son Benjamin. Benjamin is now 10. He had a pretty tricky start to life. So by the time he started school, Benjamin couldn't really talk properly, he couldn't hear properly, and he certainly couldn't speak properly. And so I'd had about 5 years of his life and my life advocating for Benjamin and having the system, his ophthalmologist, his GP, his audiologist, his speech language therapist, and his teachers, all of whom had his best interests at heart, early childhood teachers, always approaching me with what was wrong with Benjamin and what we needed to do, what I needed to do as an individual for Benjamin's best outcome and his best, what I need to do as an individual to help Benjamin have a better life. And when Benjamin started school, his year 1 new entrant teacher came to me and she said, "Hey Emily, I just need to have a chat with you. Do you mind coming to see me?" And it was a Friday afternoon. I was having a really rough time at work, and I said to her, "Look, I know you've got Benjamin's best interests at heart, but if you're going to tell me what's wrong with him again, I just don't have the strength for it." And I felt pretty emotional about it, and I had all this baggage from the last 5 years. And she took one look at me and she said to me, "Actually, Emily, Benjamin is amazing at maths." And ever since that point, I've worked with Fiona, his teacher, who still sees him every fortnight to do maths with him, to understand how the system can support Benjamin to lean into his strengths and to be the best kid he can be. And at 10, Benjamin is really good at maths and has used those skills to be able to learn to read, to be able to participate in his classroom. And when you look at Benjamin now, you can't see all of those things that the system perceived as wrong with him. And I tell you this story because as a system, as charities and philanthropists and impact measurers, we really need to think about what do we measure so that the system shifts to support the individuals that we care about so that their lives and New Zealand can be a better place. So that's where I start from when I start thinking about what do we measure and how. And I established Impact Lab with 4 other co-founders to really create a piece of infrastructure that will help us do that as a system. So Impact Lab has a range of tools. The fundamental one is called Good Measure. It helps you value the goods that you do in a concrete and robust evidential way. I'm really happy to talk to people about that. But today I'm just going to talk to you about how do you measure the good you do when the impact of philanthropic giving is uncertain, hard to quantify, and how do you see your role in the system to improve outcomes for individuals? Because that's what we're here to do. Because at the moment, until now, there's really been no way of understanding what does good look like. There's been no way of benchmarking progress and how do you improve what happens. We know we feel good about it, and as Sue started saying, there's more and more scrutiny about what does feeling good mean and how do we move forward strategically together. And what is the best way to invest your philanthropic dollar? So at Impact Lab, we work with a range of charities and grant seekers, and most of our work is funded by grant makers. And a really trusted philanthropist advisor of mine said to me, you know, Emily, my money's been hard earned. I want to see that it's having the greatest impact that it can have. Not that it's not trust, that he doesn't trust that that's happening, but there's no way of comparing that so that the system grows as a whole. So these are the reasons that we started Impact Lab. So that we can understand the impact of philanthropic giving and start to quantify it. With my background, I really saw this as a data and information problem. So how do we collect and connect the right information to understand the good we do so that we can think about how do we improve the outcomes for individuals as a system. Information, as you'll know, on charities is siloed, and the JB Ware report is a really great improvement on our shared understanding of what happens. And there's no system for recording impact, no repository, no standard calculator. And more importantly, what that means is that we can understand our isolated impact, so we can start to think about how do we improve what we do as individual organisations or individual grant makers. We can, as we're starting to do in New Zealand and across the world, start to think about how do we collaborate for better outcomes. So we're all aiming at the same target. How do we improve the outcomes for vulnerable women? How do we improve what happens for children in Christchurch? How do we improve what we know and what we can do for those who've been affected by the earthquakes or the terror attacks? And this allows us to share information and to start to trust each other. But when we start to measure outcomes, what we can do is start to move to having a collective approach, which means we can do each of the individual bits of the system that we do best, whether in my story about Benjamin, you're the audiologist or the ophthalmologist or his preschool teacher. We can start to do each of the pieces that we do best to create a better outcome for him and for the people that we serve across New Zealand. So when we have a common goal and a shared measurement system, we can then start to say, right, how do I put my efforts best to serve that outcome that we all share? And that lets us see what we do as a system rather than unconnected, individualized bits of the process. So I'll leave that piece there. You know, it's a cliche, measure what matters, or what you measure gets done. But from my point of view, we should really be measuring what we value, because what we choose to measure comes to define our success. So as when Sue introduced me, measuring the change that we deliver in people's lives helps us understand what works for different people and the cost of that relative to the value that's created through the change that we create in their lives. And the ability to tangibly demonstrate success allows this learning to be shared and improved on by other organisations with different strengths. So if you think about my previous slide, it lets us, when we measure in a shared way and tangibly share our improvements, we can move from collaboration into a collective impact kind of approach. Tangible improvements in people's lives, consistently measured to show how your theory about how your activities link to the effects and the changes that we see in the real world, strengthens your case for funding as charities, and does allow you to collaborate and to then scale your innovations. So I guess my ask of you is that with coherent and consistent measurement, the sector's diversity of strengths, diversity of approaches actually become its strengths rather than a point of tension in the system. So how do we introduce a consistent measurement approach which lets the diversity of how become the strength of what we do every day? And I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about how you can do that. So one last thought on this. When we have a consistent measurement approach, we can understand impact, we can understand the levers that we have to create improvement, we can then understand the value that we create, which lets us seek more funding and use it for better, have a greater sense of impact, which leads to a greater sense of improvement, and we create virtuous investment cycle. So how do we do that? That all sounds pretty grand. Conceptually, it's pretty grand. Actually, day to day, it's really, really pragmatic. So for both funders and grant seekers, what I'd recommend is start by measuring what you do. Next, then by understanding what happens now, you can then start to think about measuring what have you learned about what you do and how do you improve. And then thirdly, you can say, and what impact does that have on the communities that we're here to serve? And I'll give you just a little bit more detail on each of those. So really practically, when you first start thinking about measuring impact, how many people do you serve? What is the cost per person for successful delivery? Do your costs and outcomes look different for different groups that you work with? And how does that look? And can you articulate the outcomes that you want to achieve for people? So knowing these things helps you as grant seekers understand what adjustments you can make to become even more impactful. And it gives funders confidence that you know who you're working with and how you will continue to evolve your service delivery to be as impactful as you can. So I would talk about that as being the first stage when you're starting to think about impact. It may lead to more income. When you're starting to think about impact, start to think about who is it that you work with, how do you work with them, what does it cost, and what do you want to achieve. The second part lets you say, once you know those things, you can start to say, what are we learning here about how we work with people, how much it costs, and the change that's creating over time. And knowing these things lets you improve your service delivery and invest your money wisely and demonstrate to investors and funders that you are investing their funds, hard-earned, in changes that really will make a difference for the people that you work with and that you act on behalf of and that they are investing in. This then lets you start to think more broadly. What are the changes that we are beginning to see that are happening at a local and regional level? So to be put really bluntly, once you understand the size of the change that can be made for a group or for society, that actually does let you start to partner with people who share the outcomes that you hold dear, because you understand that the size of the impact that you can have and whether you are in a position to meet all of that opportunity, or whether you need to partner with people who are also working in the same space so you can have the biggest impact for the group of people or the outcome that you want to change. You can start to really see how does your service connect with these outcomes, and there are evidential ways of demonstrating how more or less likely you are to be successful in changing that outcome, and what factors within your service delivery model will have the greatest effect on these outcomes and how they're being addressed in community. So at this stage, once you understand who you work with and how you work, once you understand as a system the pieces that you have together to start to make those changes and the levers that you've got, you can then say, and here is the size and the value of the change that we are seeing in community. And I would say that my experience is that people often leap to this finally stage. They want to say, because of what we do, 20,000 children are no longer hungry, without actually understanding the pieces of what they do and how that links to 20,000 children no longer being hungry. And what Kirsten wants is to understand, how is the money that I grant to you changing? How are you using that to make children not be hungry? So if you think about measuring impact in 3 stages, what do we do, how do we learn, and what impact does that have on the communities that we serve, it creates a nice accessible framework wherever you are at your impact journey to start to think about the shifts that you make and the way that you're investing the funding that you have. So firstly, measure what you do. Secondly, measure what you learn. And thirdly, measure the system level shifts that you create through doing what you do well and adapting as you learn new things.
Thank you, Emily.
a rapid bolt through impact measurement. The only piece I would add there, that there are tools in terms of valuing the shifts in that you make for community, and they are standardized comparable tools. So Impact Lab's tool is called Good Measure. We connect the good you do with your service delivery model with the value of that outcome for New Zealand. And the Treasury has a tool as well. I'd like to say it's less sophisticated than ours, but you know, use what actually works best for you. And then also think about the data that you've got in those buckets. What do we do? Who do we work with? And how can we learn? And you will have a lot of that information available to you already.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful, and a really simple framework there. We do have some questions. Can you link your measurement to theories of change, strategic thinking? Can you comment on
yes, so we do. So when we think about, can you see me or just the slides?
I think, could you turn off sharing now?
Yeah, I will. Hi, everybody.
On the slide.
Okay, hi everybody. So what we do is we think about the activities that an organisation undertakes in terms of its day-to-day service delivery model, and we link that through a theory of change process to understand how did what you do every day link to the outcomes that you want to achieve. And we go into the evidence and say, is there evidence from the wisdom of what's gone before to say, yes, those kind of activities and those kind of service delivery models work to achieve those kinds of outcomes. So we validate it against the literature about what's worked before, and then we say, and what is the value of that change worth for New Zealand? And we use a range of econometric values and publicly available values for the change that's created, linking to the outcomes. So theories of change is a fundamental part of the Impact Lab approach to understanding impact. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Emily. A question, can we share your presentation after this webinar? That a couple of people have asked that.
100%. Philanthropy New Zealand have it, but I'm also really, really open to talking with people about, I mean, I'm really passionate about this stuff, so if you've got the time, yeah. You can see Kirsten laughing, she's heard me often on this subject.
That's great. So we can email this presentation out to the people who have RSVP'd, and also a reminder that we will be making the recording of this webinar available via social media if people want to share that. Another question in terms of you know, your advice for cash-strapped charities on how to measure on an absolute shoestring, and also a related question in terms of what you're seeing regarding funders funding not-for-profits to undertake measurement.
Okay, so we'll answer the first one first. Cash-strapped charities in terms of measuring what matters. So I think even to be effective in your service delivery model, really concentrating on who do we work with, how much does it cost us to work with each of them, and what can we do to, for example, understand how many people successfully complete our program or successfully participate in our initiative. Those three things are a really strong way to start to think about impact and just do the work you do even better. So it doesn't, you can invest in sophisticated tools, but from my point of view, asking yourself kind of those three key questions in the first instance, and alongside that, thinking about what is the decision, if I understand this information, what is the decision I'll make differently, are really simple questions, but if you can answer them, you will see a shift in your impact, you know, within the next year, because you'll be focusing your activity on the things that make a difference. So I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, let Sue know and she'll come back around and ask me. The second one is, sorry, Sue, could you ask me again?
The second one is around what you're seeing in terms of funders supporting not-for-profits to undertake measurement activity through actually providing resource for them to do so.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, you know, I've got a fairly, that those funders who want to understand impact have found Impact Lab and are supporters of ours. So I guess I'll talk about the funders who are really interested in understanding impact, and Perpetual Guardian was the first one. So thank you, Perpetual Guardian. They're our cornerstone, one of our cornerstone philanthropic organisation that we work with, and there is the opportunity for if you work with Perpetual Guardian to also work with Impact Lab, because they do have seen the impact of understanding your impact and the way you run your charity and the difference that you can make. So Perpetual Guardian have been a big supporter, but Impact Lab's been going about 18 months now, and we've got 4 or 5 large philanthropic families actually who have come on board with us and are investing in us to help their favourite charities and charities that they support understand their impact so that they can improve their business model. So they're seeing that as a piece of intellect or advice that they haven't had access to before. And then thirdly, the Jujok Foundation, so Fran Wyborn, who is a founder of Impact Lab, has been a great supporter of us in the beginning, has just started her own foundation, and her foundation is set up to work with those charitable charities who do want to understand their impact and are committed to going on that impact journey. And so I guess we are starting to, what I would say is we're starting to see a shift in philanthropists and their expectations around charities' ability to articulate their impact, and go one step further to quantify it. So for us, impact is not a comms and marketing exercise. It's a fundamental piece of improving the quality of the service that you deliver for New Zealanders to make New Zealand a better place. And I think that's the shift there.
And just to add to that, hi, it's Kirsten, Perpetual Guardian here. We are working towards more funding of evaluation impact assessments. Those are ordinarily, or at the moment for us, alongside of projects where we have also significantly funded the project, but there are some anecdotal evaluations that we fund. I can't think of a huge number of applications we've received into trusts for purely for evaluation. For example, saying, you know, we ran a youth program that matches with Ted and Molly Carr. We're now really looking for funding to do some evaluation on that so that we can move it forward, upwards, onwards. But we are talking to our staff about looking upon those applications favourably. So, you know, please consider that when applying to the funds that Perpetual Guardian manage.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing I would say for cash-strapped and volunteer-led organisations is that because of the advent of big data and because of the evidence about what works that already exists, actually understanding, linking that to you and your service delivery model is a much quicker, easier process than it's ever been before. So these days you don't need to think about evaluation as being a 5-year, 6-figure process that your organisation that needs to go through, at which point you have an academic report which doesn't tell you what to do next. You can start to think about impact in terms of what is the change or the decision I need to make, and how do I corral the information and already exists out there together to understand that impact. So yeah, I feel like there's a real shift in the technology and data availability to create a much easier insight into impact than has been possible previously.
That's great. Thank you so much, Emily. And, you know, for those like cash-strapped and voluntary-led organisations, this could be an area where they could consider getting in a specialist skilled volunteer to give them some advice. So, you know, there are some platforms out there like Help Tank and Collaborate. If your talk, Emily, has inspired anyone to think about taking some steps in terms of measuring the impact, that's also another option. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you very much to our sponsor, Perpetual Guardian, for your support for today's event and for your support for those face-to-face events that we really, really sadly needed to cancel. And thank you so much to our attendees for your interest, for your time today, for asking questions, for providing comment. Please do fill out the survey that we're going to send to help us keep on track with our offerings.
We like to understand our impact.
Yes, exactly. I won't show you the survey, Emily. Yeah, and we are going to share this recording, so please do share it widely if you think you know people that would also benefit from some of the gems we've heard from our speakers today. So, kia pai tō rā, have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much, everybody. Mā te wā.